Ah, the PlayStation. First released in 1994, back when gaming was much simpler and when 3D was only on computers. That changed with the fifth generation, with the PlayStation having the most impact. The PlayStation was the turning point for the gaming industry, and everything that the gaming industry stood for was reaching maturity by the time the PlayStation came into market. The history of the PlayStation goes back to a failed venture with another company, and how one person changed the course of the gaming industry. So, of course, what if we did an alternate history of the PlayStation? And before we continue, as someone who once played the original PlayStation as a young boy, I have a lot of connections to this console, as it was the first console that my parents got for me. Now that we got that down, let's get started. First, we cover the failed venture between Sony and Nintendo. But wait, we need to talk about Sony in the 70s. Wait, the 70s? Where does Sony fit into the story? In the 1970s, the gaming industry was just getting started. While companies like Atari, Philips, and other corporations were releasing Pong consoles, Sony in Japan was planning on releasing a console that used cartridges/cards. While it didn't have a name, it had a label named the Prototype TV Game Machine. However, nothing came out of the console. However, that doesn't mean that Sony would still enter the gaming industry when Sony entering the publishing industry after the release of the MSX, with Sony publishing games from other companies like Konami for the European market, as an example. However, this wasn't the main focus of Sony's business, as the corporation as they are known today is an electronics company that in a few years would buy Columbia Pictures and CBS Records, with one of the founders named Akio Morata being the honorary member and even for a moment the board of directors for Pan American Roadways until the mid 1980s. I thought I wanted to mention it. Now let's get into the story, with first the failed venture between Sony and Nintendo and their add-on for the Super Famicom. As you all know, the venture between Sony and Nintendo was for the Super Famicom or Super Nintendo outside of Japan. Later on, as the console was getting ready for its 1990 release in Japan, Sony's small team presented an idea for an add-on to the Super Famicom with a disc attachment below the Super Famicom. Seeing that its rivals NEC and Sega were developing a CD-based add-on for their consoles, Nintendo would greenlight the project. However, after a year of development, the president of Nintendo, named Hiroshi Yamauchi, looked over the contract and learned that Sony was to benefit from the deal, so Yamauchi would make a deal/venture with the Dutch giant Philips for their add-on for the Super Nintendo, along with a standalone console named the CDI, which was made by Philips. And after dropping Sony with Philips, the add-on was to be released in 1992 alongside with the Japanese release of the CDI, or later in the year. However, nothing would come out of this partnership and would instead cancel the add-on for the Super Famicom. However, the software that Philips would release for the CDI would become infamous in Nintendo circles, and even a game based from it. And as for their CD based console, they wouldn't enter the disc market until the release of the GameCube in 2001, long after the partnership was terminated, with their fifth generation console, the Nintendo 64, a console which had the games but not the disc for the storage, which in that generation would become their biggest weakness against their former venture, which would bring third party developers into the PlayStation, with Final Fantasy VII being a turning point for the console. While the venture between Sony and Nintendo after 1991 was out of the question, with the founder of the PlayStation named Ken Kutaragi, with his work earlier making a soundtrack for the Super Nintendo, which had already made an enemy of Kutaragi, wanted to leave the gaming market altogether, and even fired him for bringing Sony into this mess in the first place. However, the leader of Sony, Nario Oga, told him to make the console with the work they had went into the project being remade from scratch, with Sony Music of Japan and Sony forming a new venture and a division named Sony Computer Entertainment. And with this, the PlayStation was born, and history would be made, as everyone else was pushed out of the market, or in Nintendo's case, holding on for dear life. One more thing before we go over the subject of the video, we need to talk about the PlayStation itself. The PlayStation was a 32-bit system that could handle 3D graphics, which was a revolution in technology of its time. It used a CD-based system, which would also allow players to play music CDs that were hits of their days, like Michael Jackson as an example. However, three downsides were common with the PlayStation, with the first problem being that the 3D graphics didn't have depth buffer, or as it's commonly known as Z buffering, as it was based on a machine that was released 10 years earlier that was used for marketing. The second problem, and it was carried over to the PlayStation 2, was the memory cards. And while it wasn't an issue at first, the problem with the PlayStation was the memory size that a save would take, as the CD didn't have enough space or would take a lot of time to load a disc. So Sony would release a physical card that would allow players to save their progress. And the third problem, which was why was there two control ports? Now here in 1994, the idea of playing with more than two people wasn't something that common at the time. However, the Nintendo 64 was already announced alongside with a picture of it. It makes me wonder why Sony didn't place another two control ports into the console. But wait, Sony wanted to be different from everyone else, so why Sony would release an attachment for another two controller ports later in the console's history. But that's not to say that the system was bad. It had a lot of great things built into the console, and the games is what most people cared about, and with Sony and later third-party companies making games for the PlayStation, as it would be the first console to sell 100 million units. Now that you understand the history, let's go over the alternate scenario. What if the PlayStation was a failure? After understanding the PlayStation and why it became a success, now we have to do the reverse. However, that's easier said than done, as the PlayStation had a number of third-party developers, and later on first-party developers. So in order to make it a failure, we have to make changes to the other consoles, which is easier said than done because most 5th generation consoles had their own shortcomings, with the Atari Jaguar having cartridges, which in 1993 would be fine, except 2 years later they had a CD attachment as the cartridges were limited compared to CDs. Not that Atari itself was already having problems with the company. While the 3DO, a console that was released in 1993, it was easy to make games for it. The problem was the distribution, in which other companies would make the console much more expensive to sell, and a $3 deal, well, didn't work out in the end. And we have the Sega Saturn, a CD-based console that came out in the same time as the PlayStation in Japan, was more powerful. However, because the 3DO on the Saturn was much harder to make than the PlayStation, it resulted in the later generation being in third place compared and not helped with the public thinking that it was a 2D console. Wait, you're missing a console here. I'll get to it. Calm down. So now that we have an idea of why it failed, we need to figure out which console could be more successful. For my money, I would pick the 3DO and Sega Saturn, as the Jaguar from Atari was struggling to stay in business and ended support for the Atari ST, a computer that was released in 1985, didn't help matters, and which by that point, newer computers came out. For the 3DO, we don't have to change much except for the 3DO to sell to another company. In which case, let's sell them to Panasonic, as it was the most to gain from the 3DO in our timeline with the N2 project. And drop the $3 deal. This isn't Subway, where you go to make your sandwich. It's a gaming console that needs good software, not plumbers making nerds angry. While the Sega Saturn was molded by Sega of Japan, the American division of Sega released the 32X. Okay, we need to kill the 32X here, because it was one of the factors that doomed the Saturn when it came out in North America. And I also learned that Sega of America and Japan had issues at this point in time. Great, this is already long as it is. But wait, there's more. Turns out, before Sony released the PlayStation, Sony had approached Sega of America about releasing the prototype PlayStation with Sega. However, Sega of Japan declined their offer, which would come back to haunt Sega. But if the PlayStation was a failure, how does that work? What kind of decisions would it take for this scenario to happen? For me, I've been thinking about it, and in the end, I don't have a clear answer for it. Maybe if Sony did a Panasonic in our timeline and released the PlayStation with no first-party games for about a year, it might have the same outcome like the 3DO. However, one difference is that the Sega Saturn would, regardless of any timeline, was a success at the start. With the PlayStation not having a lot of games compared to the Saturn, it might give Sega a stronger chance to compete with Sony and later on with Nintendo and 3DO, as the 3DO might do better in the West. I say this because when it was released in Japan, it started off well. However, once the Japanese companies released their products in 1994 with the Saturn and PlayStation, it was all over. And because of this, the 3DO quick rise was thrown out the window before it even got a chance. Here in this alternate timeline, the 3DO would have a lot more Western third-party support with Electronic Arts, followed by Activision, Take-Two, Acclaim, Midway, ASC Games, Blizzard, Interplay, Accolade, Eidos, Ubisoft, Infogrames, Codemasters, while in Japan, companies like Capcom, Konami, Hudson, Koyo, Bandai, Data East, Tecmo, Enix, Sunsoft, SNK, Irem, ASCII, Atlas would be on Team Sega. Wait, what about Namco and Square? And where is Nintendo in all of this? It will come in due time, I promise. Let's get back to what we're doing, okay? As for Namco and Square, let's start off with Namco, given that they were rivals in the arcades with Sega. I'm willing to bet, and this was the case in our timeline, Namco would support the 3DO with games like Ridge Racer, Tekken, Tails being released only for the 3DO in the Solitaire timeline. As for Square, that one would be the hardest for them to be placed in, as their games became successful in the 5th generation alongside with the PlayStation. So games like Final Fantasy VII or whatever it becomes in this alternative timeline would have to find another console to make the game for it. Well, the 3DO was much slower and was much more limited in 3D compared to the two 32-bit consoles, and the Saturn was difficult to make games on it, and the Nintendo 64 was on cartridges, so where does Square go? Well, the PC. That is the answer. Wait, what? Why the PC? You see, Square for a brief moment had released some of their games on PC after the release of the PlayStation version was released first. But instead of the PlayStation, the PC would be the company's choice to make games on, much like Neon Falcon and Valve when they were getting started. Which would mean that Final Fantasy VII would be the first fully 3D RPG, maybe, or it might be the same like the PlayStation version, but better detailed. Who knows? It's just one scenario. Is there anything else that I should try to explain? Oh yeah, that's great and all, but what about the PlayStation never existed? Great question. Let's talk about that. Wait, I didn't mean it much like I explained earlier in the video. But here, what if the PlayStation never existed? Much like our alternate timeline I finished explaining a few moments ago. But there is a more difference than just the PlayStation never succeeding. Instead, if Sony never got into the gaming business in the first place, then our factors would have to be explained. 1. The Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo was a 16-bit console that, here in the West, was competing against the Sega Genesis, with the advantage of being its sound capabilities. However, because Sony never sold them the sound chip needed for the Super Nintendo, the console's sound design would be much closer to the Genesis, meaning soundtracks like Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, Earthbound, and third-party games like Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy 4-6, etc., and many more would sound similar to what you would hear on the Genesis. 2. The Sega CD. The Sega CD was an add-on for the Genesis. Sony, via ImageSoft, would publish the games that took advantage of the FMVs. However, like with the soundtrack for the SNES, games like Sewer Shark from Digital Pictures would have to find a different publisher or self-publish the game. Unlike the SNES soundtrack, this wouldn't affect the Sega CD that much, with or without Sony, as the Sega CD didn't do all that well because at the end of the day it was an attachment for the Sega Genesis. Well, after doing all that research, I feel like this video has reached its conclusion. So as usual, thank you for watching the video. Hold on, you forgot to mention Nintendo and the future alternate timeline. Oh, I wasn't even close yet. Let's start with Nintendo, the one that started the whole saga. If the PlayStation was never a success or didn't exist, it's possible that Nintendo would have some third-party support. However, it was only a matter of time before third-party developers left Nintendo. As this issue was growing during the first mainstream console, the NES, and later on with the 16-bit console war here in the West with the Genesis. This means that the Nintendo console that competed with the PlayStation would have a very different outcome than our own timeline. Oh, of course, it's the Nintendo 64. The Nintendo 64 was released 1 year after the release of the PlayStation and the Sega Saturn in the West, and 2 years in Japan, and 3 years for both the Atari Jaguar and the 3DO. This would have had an advantage when it came to graphics of that generation. However, without the PlayStation taking third-party developers, it would have had a much better chance of success than it had in our own timeline. However, I have a feeling that it wouldn't win the console war. Even though their biggest competitor doesn't exist or failed, that still would have put them in second or third place in the console war between Sega and 3DO. And let's say that the Nintendo 64 still remains in second place. Well, like in our timeline, nothing would change. And I should have explained this earlier in the sentence that some third-party developers would move to the 3DO or Sega Saturn, then work with the Nintendo 64. This would have resulted in games being delayed that generation or moved to those two consoles. But making things even more dire for the N64, had the Nintendo 64 been in third place after the success of the two consoles, namely the Sega Saturn and 3DO, it would have forced Nintendo's hand into making a new console before the two companies released their successor consoles. However, unlike Sega, Nintendo wasn't as broke, and the success of Pokemon would still make the company profitable even if the Nintendo 64 was in third place. Boy, that was a lot, but I feel like there's more, isn't it? Wait, what about Sony's future consoles? Alright, I need to address that as well. Let's find out together. If the PlayStation was a failure or never existed, then the PlayStation 2 wouldn't exist at all. This would have had the biggest change in our timeline, with the biggest chance happening to everyone else in the console market. With the short answer that Sega would still make consoles if they were in a stronger position, Nintendo would have a much higher sales number, and the 3DO, well, we'll get to that part soon. The long answer is that without the fear of the PlayStation 2, the Dreamcast would have another chance of survival if Sega was more profitable and stable compared to our timeline, while the GameCube, the successor to the Nintendo 64, would have a much higher sales number, as in our timeline, the GameCube only sold 22 million units. Well, this number would go up higher, up to 30 million units sold, with more games coming out for the GameCube. With the Dreamcast having a lot more games coming out for it in this alternate timeline, and being remembered for having some of the best games that came out from that generation, while the GameCube would have been seen by gamers that got some third-party support back after the failures of the Nintendo 64 sticking to cartridges and a weak library. This is one sample that could play out, while on the other hand, it might be the same outcome, except instead of Sony, it's someone else in this alternate timeline. And as for the 3DO, we'll get to them shortly after we finish with everything else in the video. One thing I forgot to explain is the studios that made the PlayStation. Well, here, without the games like Crash Bandicoot, Spyro the Dragon, Gran Turismo, or anything Sony published or co-published, where would the studios go instead? Let's start with Crash Bandicoot with Naughty Dog. The studio today is known for their story-driven games like The Last of Us, both the good and the bad, were very different and at one point competed with Mario and Sonic, with Universal being the other co-publisher along with Sony. It became their mascot for the original PlayStation. However, in this alternate timeline, if the PlayStation was never a success or didn't exist altogether, like a broken record after saying this over and over again, Crash Bandicoot would have to find a different platform. I'm willing to bet this would be on the 3DO, along with Insomniac Games, as before Spyro, their first game, Destructor, was planned to be on the 3DO. Well, like I said many times now, that it wouldn't be the case, as it would come out for the 3DO in 1996. And as for Spyro, it's the same result. Now, what about Gran Turismo? This is a tricky answer, but if I had to guess, it would have never existed, as the creator of the game joined Sony to push 3D capabilities of the PlayStation. However, where does he go? Surprisingly, he might be a professional race car driver, because you see it in our timeline. That's actually what happens, if you can believe it. It's just that nobody ever talks about that, because he was a game developer, not a race car driver. Let me check if there's anything else that Sony published on the original PlayStation. Alright, I almost forgot about Psygnosis, the makers of Wipeout. Let's take a detour for a moment. Sony had bought the studio in 1993. However, in this alternate timeline, for the PlayStation to never exist, the company would still have to be independent. However, given that a number of British publishers didn't make it in the fifth generation, with companies like Ocean, Gremlin, US Gold, Virgin would be sold, merged, or defunct, this places Psygnosis in a hard hat. Let's say they get bought by another company. Who do you think it might be, you may ask? Infogrames would have given that they had bought Ocean and were looking into buying Gremlin. It could be, but that doesn't mean that they would do it. Or maybe Take-Two, which in our timeline was a North American publisher of some of their PC games, so it could make sense to buy them. If that doesn't work, maybe Eidos could buy the studio and making them the largest European company with Infogrames and Ubisoft for a brief moment? Maybe. It's just one scenario, and we need to explain back on topic about the PlayStation and its outcomes. There's one more thing we need to go over: the future of the alternate timeline. One thing that changes for sure is that without the PlayStation, there wouldn't be an Xbox. Sure, Microsoft was a gaming company on the PC, but most of their games outside of the market saw Microsoft as a software company that was known for Windows. And this would be no different had the PlayStation not become a success, or maybe it would have still entered the console market if the 3DO had become a success. In that case, we would still get an Xbox or even Microsoft buying the 3DO company and making their next generation console, which would become the Xbox. Outside of the console manufacturers, the industry takes much longer to grow, as without Sony's first or even bigger second console breaking sales records in the entertainment, the industry would be much slower to change. However, online gaming would still exist, would be a much smaller business compared to our timeline. Another thing that changes is what games exist in this alternate timeline. Keep in mind today, as games that started on the PlayStation or became mainstream in addition to Crash, Spyro, Gran Turismo, and Wipeout would also affect The Last of Us, Uncharted, God of War, Ratchet & Clank, Jak and Daxter, Sly Cooper, Infamous, Ghost of series, Horizon, Killzone, the Ego games like Shadow of the Colossus, The Last Guardian, and the original Ico, Fatal Frame, Kingdom Hearts, Demon Souls, which would also affect the Dark Souls, Bloodborne, and even Elden Ring, Armored Core, Grand Theft Auto, Red Faction, Silent Hill, Katamari, Devil May Cry, Tekken, Ridge Racer, Metal Gear Solid, Danganronpa, Vagrant Story, Suikoden, Persona. Wait, Persona? Why that series? Oh, it started on the PlayStation. Never mind then. Isn't there anything else that started on the PlayStation? Siphon Filter, Bubsy 3D, and the recent game, Days Gone, might be affected by this as well, as it might get moved over to the 3DO or Sega Saturn. Isn't there anything else besides those games? Time Crisis? Okay, that one was a pretty good light gun game, I will give them credit, but that came in the arcade first. You forgot to mention Twisted Metal. Whoops, I didn't put that in the script. Good point. Then what about Max Payne? No, Max Payne started off on the PC. It really wouldn't affect the PlayStation that much. Oh yeah, Dragon Quest 7 and 8. They were also on the PlayStation series. And without the PlayStation, they may have been on the Nintendo 64 or Sega Saturn for Dragon Quest 7, or Sega or the 3DO's successor on Dragon Quest 8. There's also Monster Hunter. That started off on the PlayStation 2, and without the PlayStation 2 existing, where would it go? My guess would it be on the Xbox, but given that the Xbox had a hard time in Japan, my best assumption would have been on the GameCube, as the GameCube really struggled to have RPGs on the system. What else would we have in this alternative timeline? Oh yeah, you forgot to mention this game, Xenogears. It was a PlayStation 1 game that was made by Square. How did you not mention that earlier? Wait, Xenogears? Don't most gamers call it Xenoblade nowadays? Yeah, why do you ask? And say goodbye to Xeno and Monosoft, the ones who made the game. Wait, what? The only reason why Xeno existed in the first place was because Square didn't want to make a darker Final Fantasy VII game. And you want to know where Final Fantasy VII was made on? The PlayStation. Oh wait, there's more. Because Monosoft joined Nintendo in 2007, after working with Namco for a brief moment and releasing Baten Kaios on the GameCube, that also would affect that game as well. And some of their games impacted by Monolith Soft as a co-developer, so say goodbye to Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, Mario Kart World, and Splatoon. Yeah, those games, the ones that everyone praises and says that they're the best games ever. Well, Mario Kart World is debatable. Yeah, Monolith Soft also actually had a hand in making these games. And without them, well, let's just say those games would be even emptier than what we would have gotten. So yeah, they also impact you too. Wow, this was much more in detail than when I first started. I hope maybe I could try to get out of the alternate history and move into something else. As for what it is, I have to find out for myself. And as usual, thank you for watching the video, and until next time, bye.